you looking to sharpen your budgeting skills? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Budget Couple Podcast, where we talk about life, family, and how to afford it. And now, the Budget Couple themselves, Nate and Danielle.
Welcome to the Budget Couple Podcast. I'm Nate.
And I'm Danielle.
And this week we're going to be talking about budget ratios. We'll explain what that means in just a minute. But before we start, I really want to ask you if you could add a review to Apple Podcasts or your podcast player of choice. It really helps the show out, and we would greatly appreciate it. But now let's dive into budget ratios. Budget ratios are really a way to help you think about your budget or set it up so that you can figure out if you're spending too much money on something. We use ratios to help us determine if we can actually afford something and if it's consistent with our lifestyle and our income. For example, if I wanted to purchase a Tesla Model S, which I desperately do, the payments on that would really match about our living expenses, about $1,400 a month. That would be what's going out, and that includes like going out expenses, personal budgets, utilities, all that stuff. That's what we spend a month, about $1,400 on those things. That would be what the payment for a Model S. I'm talking about a top-of-the-line Model S. We're not dealing with base models here. So it's a beautiful car, but it's really not consistent at all with our lifestyle or income. So it's a way for us to be like, no, we can't do that, no matter how much I want it, because I want it.
I want things too. I want to go to Madagascar really bad. I want to go to Seychelles, Maldives. There's plenty of things that we'd love to do that just aren't in our ability at the moment.
Right, and that's not a bad thing. It's good to have goals and it's good to want things, but that's a key distinction is wants from needs. And I think setting up a ratio is a good way to determine what is a want and what's a need, because you can quickly plug something in and see if it's out of whack with the ratios. We're going to review in this podcast our general rules, and we'll go over our actual budget as far as how it breaks down on the general rules that we set up. We'll also talk about another budgeting system that deals with ratios in a much more simple version than what we do, I think, but it's also a little bit more engrossing when you really dive into it. So I like ours because it's a little bit more detailed, but not crazy at the same time.
So a quick note before we get started. Basically, all of this is going to be done based on take-home pay. So this is what is actually getting deposited into your bank account after things like taxes, insurance, maybe pre-tax retirement funds. So we do this because the money never actually gets to us. It never gets to our bank account. All that is taken out ahead of time. So it doesn't particularly make sense to do budget ratios around money that you actually never get to see.
Right. If, let's say I made $120,000 a year, I don't, but let's say I did, and that's $10,000 a month in income, that $10,000 a month does not go into my bank account. That gets taken a good chunk of that by the government and other places. So I don't really have that. It makes sense to budget based on what you bring home. Now let's dive into our general rules of thumb. There's going to be a couple of them here, and the percentages are pretty easy, and I'll go over why we have them set up the way we do once we get into our budget itself. But the first one is housing. You must have a place to live. Shelter is a basic human need. You must have them. Our percentage is based on 25%. We figured out what we could afford with our mortgage or rent or whatever we're living in based on 25% of our take-home income. That's including taxes, insurance, any of those type of things. The total cost should be about 25%. You can vary a little bit on these numbers because when we first bought this house, it was closer to 30% of our income, but we've paid down enough and we were able to refinance where it's actually under, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But 25% is a fantastic target to go through.
25% for transportation as well is a general estimate for us, and this would include things like your car payment, the gas in your car. For us, we only have one gas car, but we would also include into that our electric costs for the electric car, any buses you may take or metro systems, any sort of upkeep or maintenance on the car insurance. So all that would go into transportation. And again, this is a need. If you're working, you generally need some form of transportation. So for us, we're estimating about 25% of our take-home pay.
After that, so we've already used up 50% of our budget on living and being able to go somewhere. So that's a lot right off the bat. We're going to use up another 15% on retirement. We've talked about this plenty, but 15% is a great percentage to put towards retirement. It will ensure that you have a very healthy retirement and that you won't have to depend on anybody else but yourself.
And then 25% for living expenses. And this would be things like food, if you're going out to eat, any of your utilities. So things that this would be a mixture of maybe needs and wants, but basically all of your living expenses that you need from day to day throughout the month. And then finally, 10% into either just a savings account for a crash fund or something like that, or for getting rid of your debt. So maybe you're paying off a car or a house, or for us, solar panels, something like that.
Yeah, and again, these numbers change every so often based on what's going on in our life. Depending on if, let's say, I started working from home all of a sudden, our transportation costs might go down a little bit. But in general, these are the rules of thumb we're trying to keep so that we stay within line with what our income is, because we never want to live outside of our means. Generally, we really try to aim to live well below our means so we can achieve our goals later on in life.
So now we're going to move on to our budget. Our usual take-home pay is about $7,700 a month. And again, this is after all the taxes, the insurance, some of the retirement, and we'll talk about that in a second. But our mortgage is roughly $1,700 each month after our refinance, which we were really lucky to be able to take care of that and reduce our mortgage by, I think, about $300 or $400.
Yeah, it was about almost $500, I think, actually. It was a sizable amount of money, and we refinanced after only owning the house for 2 years.
It was definitely a good deal for us at the time. So that $1,700 is 22% of our take-home pay, which is a good number that we feel pretty comfortable with.
Yeah, remember, the goal is 25%, no more than 25%, and we are under that percentage at 22%. So it's a great number. We're very happy with it.
That 25% is not just our idea either. That's something that's pretty tried and true that a lot of people would suggest for most people to stay around or under.
Absolutely. Most of the ideas we're talking about here are not original, but we wanted to kind of package them in a way that makes sense and give you real life examples of what an actual couple goes through and how we kind of set everything up. So again, a lot of the things we're talking about are not unique to us at all, but they're tried and true methods that we've adapted to work for us that really do work for us.
Transportation, again, that for us would be our car payment for our Nissan Leaf that we bought recently. It would be my Metro. I actually am lucky enough to have a job that pays for part of my Metro costs, but I have to add in somewhere between $50 and $100 usually each month extra beyond that. So that would go into that transportation. Also car insurance, maintenance on the cars, that sort of thing. It's if you divide it out, average it and divide it out for 12 months, it's around $600 a month, which is about 8% of our take-home pay.
Yeah. And we do have two cars. We have a 2013 Honda Civic, but that car has been completely paid for the past 2 or 3 years. We paid that thing off very quickly. So while we do have a very small percentage, 6% compared to the 25% we suggested, it's because we already have one of our cars paid off. Cars are absolute money pits as far as money going out of your budget each month. If we had multiple car payments, this percentage would be significantly higher. Luckily, we paid it off as quickly as possible, and because of that, it's a much smaller bite out of our world.
Retirement is 15%, as we said before, but in actuality, it's not quite that much of our actual take-home pay. So we get a lot of stuff taken out pre-tax before we actually see our money. So I have a 403B at work. Nate has a teacher pension. So we have stuff that gets taken out for retirement ahead of time. What we do on our own after take-home pay is the Roth IRA that we talked about previously. So that is about 6% of our take-home pay. You're allowed to put $5,500 a year into a Roth, and that's exactly what we put in, about $450 a month.
And we'll probably be expanding that to have Danielle have a Roth here down the road, but we have some debts that we want to pay off, and we have some other things we want to do, and we'll be looking into those options a little down the road, but we first wanted to make sure that we covered the general 15% before we went through anything else. And that's what we've done so far.
Next, we have living expenses, and it's about $1,400 a month for us, which is around 18% of our monthly pay. And these are pretty random. These are things, like we said, food, going out. They are a mixture of kind of needs and wants. Maybe Nate has some other examples of things that would go into this.
It also includes our electricity bill, which right now is zero, but if we did have a cost with that, it was covered there. Our gas, as far as our natural gas for our heating, it basically covers everything that isn't covered by house, by retirement, and some of the other categories that we've talked about. But this one is really a catch-all. It's where we put money where it's things that we're not really super choosing to use, but we are choosing to use. It's a very kind of convoluted way.
Internet, cable, things like that. They're technically wants, but in our world, they're more needs than wants.
Yeah, and we could always reassign some of the utilities over to the housing expense and kind of reduce what the living expense is. And they probably, percentage-wise, would work out a little better. But as long as we have them all accounted for and we know where they kind of sit at in our ratios, it's okay. As long as we kind of make sure they're all assigned, we know what's going on and we can figure out what's happening from there.
So then we have childcare and child expenses, about $1,400 a month, which is horrible. It's so expensive around here. His daycare is around $1,000 a month, and then we also have, of course, clothes and food, extra food money for him, various other things,
and his college cost,
yes.
And all of that. That $1,400 that roughly runs for childcare expenses represents approximately 18% of our budget. So we're spending as much on our one child as we do to heat our house, to pay for the internet, to provide food, to go out, to pay for our pets. All of that stuff is taken up by 1 2-year-old currently. It's just a massive expense.
They're really expensive.
But it's okay. It's totally worth it. It's a decision that we knew would be expensive and that we're happy to take on the price of. But if we didn't have him, we would be in a significantly better financial situation.
Now, that's not a reason to not have a kid necessarily. It is something to consider, of course, when you're thinking about kids. They are rather expensive. So left over after all of these expenses is around another 18% or $1,400 each month. Now, this is if we do everything perfect, but this will go towards things like solar panels, paying off our solar panels faster, paying off our house faster, maybe putting towards trips if we're saving for a trip like we talked about last week. Basically, this is something that fluctuates probably the most for us, depending on how good we're doing each month. And funny enough, we're actually doing pretty horrible the last couple months, I'd say, where we just go over, we do things extra. It's almost like a snowball where you're like, well, I'm $50 over already, so why don't we just go ahead and go out to dinner tonight? We'll just not worry about it this month. We'll get back on track next month. And that's a big thing that we're having issues with currently, I'd say. Yeah,
I think one of our future episodes here is going to be a discussion on getting our budget back on track, because we really need to reassign some things and figure out a couple of pieces so that our budget more accurately reflects our spending per month. Because right now, it doesn't do a great job of it, because we've gone over our budget probably the last 3 months in a row, and this last month significantly over our budget.
We were expecting it. We have a trip coming up. We have a few other random things. Nate also is a 10-month employee technically, so he is not getting paid currently in the summer. So we do have to do some weird budgeting around that. But we have just been really off track. And yeah, we will probably be talking about that in the future, how we kind of just adjust things and yo-yo back and forth and perfect how we're doing our budget.
And one other note I want to make here very quickly is that $1,400 a month, which is 18%, actually really is more like 28% of our budget, or $2,100. Because of the retirement money that we talked about earlier, that extra money that we're only spending 6% on retirement, that extra percentage of the 15 actually goes into our extra money left over each month. It's just a weird thing that we have, but we just wanted to make sure we have it covered so that the numbers all really line up properly and you can understand where we're going with things.
So there's one other option out there that we'll just throw out. It's maybe a little bit more simplistic than what we have, but it may work better for some people. There's a 50-30-20 rule where you have 50% of your monthly budget going towards fixed costs, things that you have to live, your shelter, your transportation, your utilities, 30% for flexible spending, and then 20% for financial goals like retirement and such.
Yeah, and that flexible spending is a large percentage, and that's because it covers things like cell phones. It covers things like internet, where you don't have to have them, but most people do. So it kind of gets covered under flexible spending. The 50-30-20 plan is not the only other budget ratio out there, but through my research, it's a really popular one because it's so easy and it allows you to really kind of break down things very quickly. I wanted to include it here. It's not what we choose to do because we want to be a little bit more fine with it, but it's a really good tool to follow with everything.
There's definitely no right and wrong budget ratios out there. You just kind of have to pick and choose, play with some of them, figure out what might work best for you. You could even use a couple where you use something broader like this 50-30-20 rule and then go in and kind of divvy that up a little bit more finer. There's a variety of ways to do it, but basically we just want to urge you to think about it in a ratio sense when you're doing your budget.
Yeah, and what we found is using the ratio allows us to balance out our decisions so we don't make impulse decisions, which I'm very bad at. Danielle's not. She's not an impulsive person. I can be. But it allows us to live the way we want and make sure what we're doing and what we're spending our money on makes sense with our income. Because again, I want a Model S. I really do. But I'm not prepared to drop $120,000 on a car because I can't afford it. It's just not a possibility. We also want to make sure that we're not spending too much money in a particular area. If our house was 50% of our take-home pay, I wouldn't love coming home every day. The house would be much more of a burden than what it is, which is a joy. I love coming home every day. Not because it's where my stuff is, not because it's where my family is. I love it for those reasons too, but it's a good house. I really like our house a lot, and it's not a burden. It's increased in value since we've bought it, and it feels like a real blessing every day you come home.
Yeah, I mean, really, we've said this before. We and you guys work hard for your money, so you want to be able to control it. You don't want it controlling your life and having it be a part of your daily stressor. You don't want to wake up in the middle of the night worrying about money. If you budget, and whatever way you want to do it, if you use ratios or some other method, but if you budget, it allows you to have that control and it allows you to know exactly where you're putting your money, and hopefully that'll reduce the stress level quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's about all we have for today. But if you have any questions, you can always visit budgetcouple.com. And to view the show notes for this particular episode, you can go to budgetcouple.com/episode 11.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Budget Couple Podcast with your hosts, Nate and Danielle. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit budgetcouple.com. Make sure to check out the next episode of the Budget Couple Podcast, where we'll talk more about life, family, and how to afford it. We'll catch you next time.